I'll probably add a second layer of bass just to add some width and warmth. A subtractive EQ is always my first stage. Sometimes for the low end, I might take the mono part of the bass, sidechain it from the kick, or use a dynamic compressor to pull down the bass in the middle, but then widen it to the sides. But there was a band signed to Trident, and they were given demo time, and in return they signed a 5-album deal, and that was Queen.
Do you miss working on tape?
I don't miss it because I know so clearly how it sounds that I can completely recreate that in the box.
In this episode, we talk with Adam Moseley, a music producer who has worked with bands like Rush, The Cure, and Kiss. The main topic was how to work the low end in the mix, but he also shared his experience working with The Cure and much, much more. Hi, Adam. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Great to see you again. And I'm really, really looking forward to having a chat.
Our main topic today is the low end, and I have a lot of questions for you. So let's dive in. Do you have any particular philosophy when you mix the low end?
Yeah, I mean, specifically, the low end is going to vary between every song. You know, it's got different requirements. And the low end in a mix also depends on the placement of your other instruments. So part of what determines the low end for me and how I'm going to approach it is what is the purpose of the kick in the song. If the kick drum is going to be round and boomy or a little bit fuzzy, you know, not too much attack, then that's probably going to drop lower, and I've got to decide how I place my bass, my low end, around that. Then it depends on if it's an electric bass or a mono synth bass or a wide stereo bass. So there's lots of different factors, but usually the problem comes when you have instruments fighting for the same area. So when I'm designing, if I'm producing, then I'm from the get-go, I'm designing the sounds so that they're going to work together. Often I'm mixing music that I didn't record or produce. So that's a different criteria. Then I got to decide, maybe I'm going to EQ the kick drum and raise it a bit in the picture and leave the open space. Sometimes for the low end, I might take the mono part of the bass. If it's a wide, more stereo bass, I might take the mono, sidechain it from the kick, or use a dynamic compressor to pull down the bass in the middle, but then widen it to the sides. So there's no given answer, but I really do like to make sure that I have space in the middle for kick, snare, voice, you know, the main things. And then mono bass obviously has to be in the middle if it's an electric bass in a band. But if there's a way to widen it, I love doing that. And widening it, I don't generally like to use a widener plugin or an imaging plugin, because I find those mess with the phase a lot. You know, they're kind of faking the width by using phase to do that. I'd much more prefer to use a stereo delay, but just on maybe 15 milliseconds, 23 milliseconds either side, or maybe 8, 16 or something, just to slightly widen the bass. Echo Boy is great for that. Obviously no feedback. And in Echo Boy, I'll choose a preset sound, a style that has a very different sound from my original bass. So I'm just widening, but I'm not just creating a thick band of the same frequencies. Otherwise I lose the definition of the more central bass. I want it to color out to the sides, but to have a slightly different feel and to control that. So if I'm compressing the main bass, I'll also compress Echo Boy, which will be on an auxiliary track or a turn or send track, depending whether you're using Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton. You know, they all do the same thing, but they have different names. So I'll bus the widening effect, be it stereo delay or a slight chorusing. You know, I might use that just to widen the bass, but I'll compress it additionally apart from the actual bass track. So there's different ways to go about it. It's all about control. Being a producer, mixer, it's all about control. But controlling your frequencies, controlling the space, controlling the arrangement, and making sure you have space, you know, for the other instruments.
And do you usually EQ that delay?
Yeah, I will. I mean, if it's Echo Boy, then I'm going to use a preset, one of their styles.
Mm-hmm.
I might use Echoplex, or I might use Transmitter for a thin version of it. Or, there's a few really cool, unusual sounds within Echo Boy. So I'll just experiment, go through the presets, and then start to adapt it. But even if I'm using a chorus, I may put an EQ on the return track before the chorus effect so that I can control the frequencies going into the chorus.
Mm-hmm.
So, I may decide to add a bit more bass or remove some bass and add a bit more tiz, a bit more high frequencies, so that the ear feels the bass, but it has a bit more of like an exciter on the edges.
Besides that, is there any technique you use to achieve a clear low end?
Just really compression and EQ, just to really make sure what is the purpose of the bass in this track, who's going to get those frequencies. If it's the really low frequencies, down the bottom across here, is that going to be all for the bass? Where's the kick going to go? Is the kick going to be set in there as well, or am I going to place the kick a bit higher so I can really devote all of this band of the bottom of my mix to the bass? But then it's still about controlling the frequencies, compressing them, maybe limiting them if that's necessary. Maybe on the return of the effect that's widening, chorus or really tight delay, I may limit that just to really hold it in place tight. And again, with an EQ before that widening effect, I can really determine what frequencies I push into it, into the widening effect, or which ones I remove. So that's really my approach. It's so meticulous, a lot of detail, a lot of trial and error always. You're never going to, I don't think you're ever going to arrive at the immediate solution on the first go. You'll get near it, but then as you get more in the mix and you add more instruments, you're often constantly going to have to adapt a little bit.
So do you approach the low end differently depending on the genre?
Yeah, completely. Obviously, an electronic dance track, the low end is really important. That's one of the most important things, apart from the drive of the song. Even using sidechain compression from the kick is, going to be one of the most important factors that you use on that low end. And you have to get it to pump, so the sidechain compression becomes a real part of the genre on an electronic dance tune. But obviously, if I'm doing a more neo soul, with live bass or even synth bass, the bass has a different role. The bass may want to be more determined as a mono thing. Maybe there's a second layer that's been added. If I'm producing, I'll probably add a second layer of bass just to add some width and warmth, but just more as a flavor. You don't need it to be as big necessarily as a a dance tune. But if it's a mono bass, a played bass, or if it's in an alternative rock band, you don't really want to widen the bass out unless there's a bass synth being used. That's not really suitable for the genre. You want the bass to be quite specific and, generally in the middle and have a great tone about it and great space. So genre definitely determines where I'm going to go with the bass, but that's also because the genre generally determines how the bass has been recorded, and maybe there's more than one track of bass, depending on genre. Pop, hyper pop has a lot of different layers of bass. You may have 3 different layered basses going on. And I love doing that. I love layering sounds, not just bass, but kick drums. I love having a kick drum sound for my verses, and then for the chorus, maybe adding a secondary tone to the kick, just to give it more weight in the chorus, because typically more instruments come in, and often you're fighting to get your kick to still poke through on a big chorus, especially like in a rock band with lots of overdubs on the chorus. I often like to add a sub kick on certain accents, maybe on every alternate, bar, one sub kick, or maybe just once every 4 bars, add a sub kick on one hit, just to add a bit of oomph to it, and just to vary up the sound. Any slight changes in sound create a new event for the listener, and sometimes those slight changes don't need to be really obvious. They can just be little textures or little movement of position of some other instruments, or little filtering of an instrument that sounds slightly different in the verse than it does from the chorus. And all these little incremental things create a dynamic for the listener. They create a new event. Sometimes you want them to be huge and, announce themselves with a huge fanfare. Other times they're just little subtle shape shifts of sound. So it varies. That's the short answer, is it varies. And I just gave the long answer.
Perfect. No, it's perfect. So when you start a mix, do you use maybe an EQ or a tape plugin to shape the low end when you start?
I really believe wholeheartedly in not having a lot of plugins on my main fader.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to call it master fader. That's such an old term. It should be called the main fader.
Mm-hmm.
On consoles, it was often called the main fader. So it's my one-man battle to change that we don't call it the master fader. I really, on the main fader, generally, I think all you should have is a little bit of EQ. I tend to use, I use Plugin Alliance a lot. I've done mixed videos for them. They have an amazing EQ called the Digital V3, and it's a mono stereo EQ. So generally, I'll think of like the EQ I only put on at the end of the mix when the mix is done, and probably what I'll do is just pull up a little bit, boost a fraction of like somewhere between 800 or 900 to 1K, a little bit of punch in the middle, and it might only be 0.3 of a dB or 0.4 of a dB, but just to pull the mono out a bit, which is very much your mastering kind of technique. And then on the sides, I may, if I'm boosting the bass, I may do a little bit of roll off on the sides, below 30 hertz. And then I'm just going to elevate some air on the sides so that the middle is like the weight of the mix. Obviously, there's going to be high frequencies if there's other instruments in the middle of my mix in the more mono aspect. But I really want my mixes to kind of arc to the sides and up, almost like a bird, where you have the body of a bird looking forward and then its wings come up and go out to the sides. And that's how I visualize a mix. A seagull is the perfect mix because it has the big body poking forward and then it has the arch coming up and out to the sides. And that's why I feel your high frequencies should go up and spread out, and there should be a bit more body in the middle. And then I always love the Shadow Hills compressor, mastering compressor. I don't think there's anything better in the world. Every mastering guy that I've, gone to has usually had the hardware version of one of those. And when you just put it on your main fader, it's like oomph. It's just fantastic the way it adds more depth and size and warmth.
So I'm sorry, do you do that at the end, like the compressor too?
No, I mix into compression.
Okay.
So from the get-go, the minute I'm getting my kick, if I'm starting a mix with the kick drum, or I may start the mix with the voice, depending on the style of the song. But say, for instance, it's with the kick drum, the minute I get my kick drum sound and I'm happy with it, then I already have the Shadow Hills on my main fader. It'll be in bypass at first. The minute I've got my kick on its own track, how I want it, then I'm going to activate the Shadow Hills and tune that to react with the kick. Then I'll probably put the snare in and make sure that the impact of the snare is still working well with the Shadow Hills, and I'll adjust it. But as I go along, I'm always reevaluating the Shadow Hills, master compressor. I'm always reevaluating that as I add more instruments into my mix. But normally at the beginning, I'll get the kick sound, put the compressor on, I'll pull the snare up, even if I haven't finished the sound yet, pull the vocal up, maybe put the bass up, and just make sure that the Shadow Hills is kind of reacting right. And then only at the end, when I've dealt with every detail of sound on every track, will I then put the mono stereo, the mid-side EQ on the Digital V3. Then I'll put that on at the end and just see, does it need, if I add a bit more poke in the middle, Does it need it? Maybe it doesn't need it. And again, if it's anything more than 0.3 or 0.4 of a dB, then I'm going to go back into my mix. I really don't believe in trying to fix your mix on the main fader. If I've got too much bass in my mix, if the mix isn't wide enough, if I need a bit more bite or punch in my mix or a bit more high frequency cut, I will think, okay, which are the tracks for that? Let me go to the individual tracks and get them right. I think it's ridiculous trying to fix everything on the main fader, because you make one adjustment and it's going to affect every instrument. And if you're dealing with a mix of 60, 80 or 100 tracks, as often we have these days, you're not even aware of all the little changes you're making to the individual instruments if you're just doing things on the main fader. So I really would never do anything more than 0.3 of a dB or 0.4 of a dB on my mid-side EQ on my main fader.
And do you usually, or do you ever automate that EQ?
Probably not on the main fader. Okay. I would go back to whichever tracks come in at the chorus and whichever tracks are bringing the more high frequencies, and I'll automate something on those directly, so that those tracks give the boost or the bump of what I'm looking for. You can never say never. It's possible that I would do that, but I would much prefer, first off, to go back into the mix and deal with any of those issues directly on the instruments that are responsible for that.
Okay, and what about that knob, like that stereo width knob?
Yeah,
it has
the width.
Do you use it?
Yeah, I do. What I tend to do is on the Shadow Hills, which is what I'm mixing into, I'll have that at, I can't remember if it's 0.4 or number 4 on it. It's just marginal, really slight. I feel that if I go above 7 on the width, it starts to create phase fakeness about it. And I might go, oh, wow, the mix is getting wider. But if I listen to it properly, I realize that I'm losing the integrity of the sound. It's starting to mush a little bit. So generally the Shadow Hills, which is what I'm mixing into from the get-go, I'll have that on like 4 of the width, number 4. And then if I need to, I'll feed from the digital V3, the EQ that will be before the Shadow Hills. If I feel I want a bit more width, I'll experiment, because on the EQ, I'm boosting the side with a little bit more air. What I may do is feed a little bit to like 0.3 on the EQ on the width button as well. So added together, it still makes 7, the number 7 on the width, which I'm not going to go above. But sometimes it's nice with the EQ to feed a little bit of width on the side frequencies that I've boosted a hair.
Nice. Do you ever limit your mix?
No.
Okay.
I much prefer to deal with everything inside, and even the compression. I don't really want it to hit more than -2, on the VU.
So going back to the low end, what's the most common mistake you see when people are mixing bass?
Overdoing it. Too much. Too much controlling it, and maybe that results from not having precise enough monitoring. Of course, I've got barefoots, which for me, I love these for the size of my room. The MM45s, it's an 8-inch sub, but it's got the dual mid-range, and the positioning that you get in your mix and the depth and the precision of the positioning is astounding, because most of the trickery that we do in a mix, most of the effects or the delays or the cool reverby things, stuff like that, generally are in the high mids. And because these have the dual mid-range, it really, you can define everything. But I think the problem comes from a music maker not being able to hear the low end close enough. I've experimented so much with headphones. I've worked with a company from Slovenia called Olo Audio, and I've got them here. they really help me with the low end. And I want to hear a headphone experience. These are really, really good. But still, I think for most music makers, they may not have, the top end monitoring system. So you can't quite determine if the bass is a bit too full or too big, or maybe there's a bit too much 400 or 800 in there, or maybe there's just a bit too much around 30 hertz that your monitoring isn't letting you hear. It's nearly always the first thing I have to do if I'm being sent mixes is deal with the frequencies of the low end, just to get it precise and to get it under control and to get it where there aren't kind of like lumps in it, where there aren't certain elements that are just boosted too much.
So besides headphones, do you have any tips for compensating for poor room acoustics?
The only tip is by using reference tracks, which I think if any mixer says, "Oh, I don't use reference tracks," they're lying. Nearly always you want to have reference tracks.
So how do you use them?
There's certain plugins. Again, I'm not just trying to push Plugin Alliance, but there's Metric AB.
Yeah, I love that.
AB is phenomenal. It's like a jukebox.
Yeah.
You can put 16 of songs in. It doesn't load the songs into your session, so it's not using up, either DSP or it's not, burning CPU for you. Basically, it's just locating them. And before I had Metric AB, I would pull different mixes. I'd go and buy the tune, download it, put it into my session, have maybe 2 or 3 songs on different tracks. I'd output them to a different output so they weren't going through my main fader compression, because that's always a problem. You try and compare and switch, and then you've got to turn the inserts off from your main fader. So the way I have it configured, I can output tracks and listen to them that aren't going through the main fader. So that's how I used to do it. And I would just A/B. I'd play my track, solo one of the reference songs, make sure the level was the same, because you don't want to be deceived by volume, and just see if the mix that I was referencing was bigger, better, brighter. I think that's Daft Punk. Just to see if my mix was getting close to the reference track. But with Metric AB, it's even quicker. You just A/B it, and it shows you such an amazing analyzer of stereo width, frequencies,
And you can put the like a filter to just listen for the low end. It's amazing. It's an amazing plugin. Yeah.
It's incredible. So even if you haven't got that plugin, pull some reference tracks into your mix so that sitting in position, you can compare. And obviously, if you can't do that, do a bounce of your mix, put it into a playlist. Of course, the stuff in the playlist that you listen to is probably going to be mastered and EQ'd and all of that stuff. But still, you can tell if your mix is wide enough or has enough dynamics in the frequencies or the arrangement. So reference tracks is really the only way to know.
You were talking about using sidechain between the bass and the kick. Can you elaborate on that?
I was working on a mix yesterday. Obviously, in electronic music, you want that bass to really whoop, 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 to really pump. And the important thing in dance music is that the kick always has to remain present. Nothing has changed from all the disco records I worked on in the late 70s. It was all about the kick drum. The kick drum had to be EQ'd. It just always had to poke through and be present. And then you had to arrange your bass and your low frequencies around it. Back then we had certain things which, noise gates, which you send a trigger and it opens the sound. A noise gate could also be used in reverse to duck the sound. So we were doing this in the 70s. We were ducking the volume of instruments being triggered by a different instrument. Sidechain compression, typically you're using the kick. You put a compressor on the bass, and for the input to the compressor, you choose the sidechain function and allocate the kick drum to trigger the compressor. So every time the kick drum pumps, the compressor pulls the volume down. And then depending with attack and release, is how quickly the volume goes down and how quickly it recovers back in time for the next note. So sidechain compression can be used to huge effect as it is in dance music, and it really gives you that pulsating, almost backwards kind of feel. But again, if you listen to Rihanna, Needed Me, or Ariana Grande, God Is a Woman, there's the bass programming and the use of the attack on the note and the way that the notes fade up slightly and also fade in is very much that kind of sidechain compression feel on bass. So you can either program your bass, if you're playing it, to have like the low attack so that it doesn't hit immediately, it doesn't smack in the face, it fades into its volume. But sidechain compression obviously can be used to huge, obvious effect to get that pumping, but otherwise you can also use it very creatively and very subtly just to make a bit of space for the kick by compressing anything else that's in the low end and ducking it, but maybe not in huge steps. Just a gentle movement just allows the kick to come through. At the same time, often if I've got like a keyboard pad or atmospheric synth sounds, which are holding sustained notes throughout my mix, and they're just creating like an area across my whole picture in my mix. What I may do from the lead vocal is use the lead vocal to trigger sidechain compression on the pad. So every time the voice sings, the volume just comes down a little bit, and as the voice stops between lines, either quickly, the volume comes back up. But if it comes up quickly, that would be distracting. The volume just fades gently up with the release of the compressor, comes back to its normal volume, and when the voice sings, it ducks down again, makes a bit more space, and then comes up. And then you also are creating a dynamic from a static track, because the pad initially was static, it was just playing sustains. Now it's living and breathing with the song and with the performance, and it works around the vocal. In that instance, if I'm doing it on the lead vocal, probably what I'm going to do, if I'm using the lead vocal to trigger the sidechain compression on the keyboard, I'll duplicate the lead vocal track, and in my timeline, I'm generally in Pro Tools, I'll just advance the duplicate of the lead vocal a few milliseconds earlier. And then, of course, the duplicate track isn't going to go into my main mix. That's purely going to go to the trigger input via a bus to the sidechain compression that's on the synth. So rather than wait for the word to happen and then quickly the compressor pulls the volume down, I can set it up to happen a few milliseconds before the word, so it already gets the signal and starts to duck just before the voice comes in, and that creates more space, and you can use it really creatively. It's quite lovely if that constant layer of synth just gently drops down just before the voice happens, and then as the voice finishes, it gently comes back up and then just gently gives way again and creates the opening for the voice. So a lot of these kind of like tricks, they're used to manage audio, but they can be also used so creatively and musically to really make a mix live and breathe and feel organic, and to get your parts to interplay with each other more in the arrangement. So they can be very creative.
Yeah, cool. Do you use that sidechain with vocal effects too?
Yeah, I may do. Yeah. Generally what I'll do is if I'm using vocal effects and I really want the vocal effects to dip or increase in volume, I'll probably automate that by hand. But it's a great option to have where you can also put a sidechain compression or a dynamic compressor, focusing on certain frequencies to dip down and then to fade back up. But usually that will work absolutely fine. But normally I'm going to automate any of that by hand on the effect, because if I'm using a delay, I may automate the amount of feedback, that I use on certain words. I may have, if there's the space, I may increase the feedback so the delay goes longer. And if it's in the middle of sung words, then I may automate that to be less. So there's less feedback, so it's not still continuing over the next words. I may even automate the EQ on that delay. So as the feedback goes on and the delay bounces, maybe I'm making it sound thinner, filtering up as well. Because all of those little events they all make events for the listener. And even if they seem invisible, when we listen, we're aware of all these little changes, and it creates something new. Anything that changes creates a new dynamic.
So can we talk about bass? What plugins do you like using on bass?
Again, it depends very much. I really like the SSL channel, depending on the style of music. If I'm doing more of a retro tune, and that on the first mix video for Plugin Alliance, I used a tune by a band called Molly with Charles. It's very neo-soul, retro, but modern as well. I came across the band, discovered them through my students at UCLA in the Herb Alpert Music School, and then I like to think I mentored them a little bit, then signed them to my licensing company.
Oh, cool.
I have a licensing sync company, and we just recently placed one of their songs in a TV show and got them some money as well, which is great. In the tune I used for them, because it was like a neo-soul retro kind of thing, I was using a lot of Neve style EQs just to add that old, and also you can get a bit of grain, on the input by driving the input a little bit, pull the fader down, turn the gain up on the red button, and you get a little bit of that kind of, not distortion, but, a little bit of edge to it, character. So depending on style, but I was one of the first SSL engineers in the UK when SSL, 4000D. I was slightly involved with Plugin Alliance on the plugin for the 4000E, so I hold that very special. But the SSL compressor on the channel strip is amazing. I'm not talking about the quad bus one. Lots of companies make them. They're all good. They all sound great. But there's something in the emulation of the SSL 4000D. I know the 9000 sounds amazing as well, but that compressor for bass, like most compressors, the more you compress, the more it's going to roll off the extreme lows and highs and make your sound punch a bit more. For instance, I can't record live drums if I haven't got a DBX 160s for the kick. Without it, I'm lost. I'll be pulling my hair out because I can't get the tightness and I can't get that kind of snap kind of on the front of the note that a DBX 160 does. But the more you increase the compression on a DBX 160, suddenly all the low end disappears until you just have a click. There's nothing left. You haven't EQ'd the sound. All you've done is increase the compression so far, that it's removing the signal. Fairchilds do the same. I love Fairchilds on overhead cymbals, the old Ringo sound, where you take away the attack of the stick on the cymbal, and with the recovery that you choose, you just get the whoosh, they're almost backwards, like the trippy Beatles tracks, that they did. A lot of them, the overhead cymbals are just very whooshy and shushy kind of thing, but you're not hearing pa, pa, you're not hearing the attack. You just, the attack gets pulled down immediately and you just hear the whoosh, whoosh, that kind of. I always come across as being insane with my imitation of sounds, but I'm probably not the only one.
No. But that makes it very clear, though. So
So bass compression. I've never been mad about 1176s on bass. I know that they really make a bass punch. So, but typically I may not use an 1176 as my primary choice on on a bass. I do like Fairchild's. Sometimes I like the DBX, as long as I'm not having to squash it too much, because again, I'm going to lose a lot of those low frequencies. So what often on treating bass, if I'm using a compressor, and as I said, I really like the way the compressor in the SSL 4000D channel, the way it just makes it punch, because it's an SSL. That's what it's going to do. It's going to make everything punch. But I like the way it handles the frequencies and pushes the bass out front. With that, if I get the compressor to be quite tight and compressing quite a lot on the plugin, I'll make sure the compressor is after the EQ. So then when I've got the compressor making it really tight, and I'm probably losing a bit of low end, because the compressor, the more it compresses, the more it filters out the low, then I can EQ some low end into the compressor. And it might look like I'm adding a lot of the black or brown button, a lot of the low end. It might look, the number doesn't matter. The number's irrelevant. We don't mix by numbers. We mix by our ears and by what feels right. The numbers are irrelevant. But I'll often pump EQ into a compressor once I've got the compressor tracked the way I want to, because I know that once the compressor's containing the sound the way I want it to and tightening up and making it punch, I know it's rolling off some low, so I know I can boost some low end back in, because the compressor's going to pull it up and tighten it again. Mm-hmm. So on bass, often I EQ before compression. I may, depending on the performance, with any performance, if it's acoustic guitar, even if it's a vocal, I might use a kind of peak limiter or peak compressor initially on the sound. So an LA2A, or for a plugin, the Summit TLA 100A is an absolute beautifully glorified LA2A with more buttons. And also I love the sound of the LA2A on acoustic guitar. It brings out the sound of the skin of the fingers on the strings. It's just magical. It hypes those high frequencies a little bit, an LA2A. And I love the way it just controls the compression. But basically, you've got input and you've got peak reduction. That's as much as you have, or gain and peak reduction. The Summit TLA 100A gives you attack and release and those kind of options. Obviously, the plugins now give you attack and release as well. But if the performance is live and there's a lot of different range in the dynamics, rather than squash everything, because if you're squashing everything, for a start, you're doing one size fits all. It's kind of a lazy move as well if you just squash it without dealing with any issues. The first stage of all sound and mixing should be deal with any issues, deal with any frequency issues in the sound, and then deal with any peak issues. So my process is always, if there's certain frequencies that are troubling me in a sound, first of all, I'm going to reduce them. Subtractive EQ is always my first stage. So I might do subtractive EQ, then peak limit a little bit. So if there's spikes on the notes, just to pull those spikes down a little bit. If I go straight for a compressor, it just means I'm pulling down the loud bits, but I'm also pulling up the quiet bits. I may not want to pull up the quiet bits. I don't want to just squash the sound with the compressor, because then I'm pulling down the loud bits, but I'm also pulling up the quiet bits. Maybe it was the intention of the performance that there's quiet notes. If it's an acoustic guitar and the thumb is on the A or the E playing a root note or something, maybe the performer intended those to be quiet, and the more arpeggiated notes, to be a bit louder, to be more expressive. If I just think, oh, there's some loud notes, let me compress it, I'm actually also pulling up the volume of the intentional quiet notes. So the first thing is always step back and think, what does this sound need? So my first step, if there's a lot of spikes in the volume, is to use a peak limiter or peak compressor, as I said, like the LA2A or the TLA 100A. Are excellent for that, because they'll just catch the peaks. You don't really hear that they're getting sucked down unless you really overdo it, but they're just going to pull it in gently. and they're not necessarily going to mess with the low end, with the lower notes or the quieter notes. So once I've approached subtractive EQ, then catching the peaks, then I may decide, now I've got that kind of controlled, now I want to enhance the sound a little bit. So I may use a second EQ and just expand the sound the way I want it to, now that my signal is the way I would have wanted it in the first place. So then I may expand the sound with EQ, maybe add rather than subtract, and then maybe add some gentle compression, which doesn't need to be that tough because I've already dealt with the peaks. Mm-hmm. So often it's about staging. And you can get lost so easily, and I see this a little bit in Ableton where, people put one plugin on, put another one on, put another, then another of the same, another EQ, another compressor, another EQ, a limiter like that. And before you know it, you've got 8 or 10 plugins on a channel. And then for some reason you think that it's still not as punchy as you wanted it to be. And basically we have to think about every time you use a plugin, however complex that plugin is, your computer and your DAW is having to process the audio. And it's having to make a latency adjustment for the processing, which with 1 or 2 plugins isn't going to be too much. But the more you put on, not just the more latency you get, so you actually lose definition in the sound, the more you try and make it more defined. So I really believe you should be as focused as you can with as few plugins as possible, and not necessarily to chain 8 or 10. I think you end up working against yourself. It also gives your computer a lot of work to deal with. And often you're chasing your tail. The more you add, the more you get. You're getting further away from what you were trying to achieve. But again, with bass, which was your initial question, there's such a variety of different compressors that I'll go about. And often with bass, like I've explained with other instruments, I'll double stage the EQ and or peak compression and then more solid compression. And I do that on voices as well. I did an amazing album with Nika Costa. I used to have a studio in LA called The Boat. We had George Martin's original Neve console from 1969 that Rupert Neve custom made for him. And I did this album for Nika Costa. Half of the album was Lenny Kravitz and half of it was Prince. And some of the songs I wanted a really full, grainy, beautiful vocal sound. And we had a Neumann Tube 48, which is just exceptional. It sounds like a 47, but it has a bit more body to it, a bit more fullness like a 67 or 87 would have. So on some songs I would use that. On other songs that she was doing live with a 57 in her hand with the full band, often on the vocal I would peak limit with like an LA 2A or the TLA, and then I'd squash it if it was the handheld 57, which is, we know it's that's a kind of harsh high mid sound. I would then use an LA3A because there's something about LA3As where they suck in the distortion a little bit. They suck in the edge. They still control just like an 1176 does, but 1176 pumps those mid-range frequencies a bit more. An LA3A just smooths it out, warms it, and it sucks in some of that edge, some of the cut. So even with vocals, I will double stage my approach to peak reduction and then compression.
Do you use distortion or parallel compression on the bass to make it more audible on small speakers?
Yes. Again, if it's played bass or even synth bass, program bass. Again, at the Boat, I used to have an Ampeg B15N.
I love that
bass.
amp.
Yeah, just most amazing. So often on bass, I should have thought of this to your questions earlier, parallel. I'll have probably the DI sound of the bass, or if it's a live bass, or the synth track for the bass, I'll have that, and then I'll bus to a parallel return and have the Ampeg B15. I may decide to have it return in mono and just put the amp just behind, or I may have the amp come back in stereo, but maybe not pan it wide, maybe pan it just a little left and right of center. So all I'm doing is keeping the bass in mono, but I'm just widening it a touch and giving it a bit more size in the middle. And then on the amp, I might on the amp, I might use a bit of distortion. I may even put a distortion plugin on the parallel before the amp, just to add a little bit of saturation or a bit of grit, or with Sound Toys, the best effects suite ever, use, what are the two? I've got the deluxe one and...
it's the double lock.
Yeah, Devil Lock.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Devil Lock is amazing. I'll often use that for a little bit of bite on the bass, or the other one with the Destroyer.
Decapitator.
Yeah, can that decapitate? Yeah,
it's an amazing plugin.
And I love the preset buttons, the 5 letters that it gives you. They have such great little character, and I really recommend. It's essential. Anyone making music has to learn the tools of their trade. You've got to learn what these buttons do. If you don't master your plugins, you're not going to apply them properly. And you're going to spend ages trying to get to the result of a sound that you might not get to if you don't know what's possible. Seriously, just put up Decapitator and put it on an instrument and just really listen to those 5 AETNP, I think they are. Just listen. Yeah, that shows how much I've studied them. Really listen to the different sound, the way the EQ changes on your sound and the size, just by using one of those preset things before you get into the parameters of how much crunch do you want, before you hit that. Is it the destroy button? I can't remember what it's called.
I can't remember, no.
Yeah.
Do you use plugins that generate subharmonic frequencies?
Yeah, I often like to use, there's one called Boom. I think it's Plug and Lines. I like to use that on the kick. And then there's another one called Sub Something, which I'll either use on the kick or sometimes I'll put it on the bass. Sometimes what I may do is take the bass track, duplicate it, and detune it. It might be that I have the original bass more in the middle, and then I might take it an octave down if it can handle that low. Filter off all the really low rumble frequencies, but maybe have that element and just widen it. It might be something that I just drop on the verse or something if there's more space, and then take that off for the chorus. But sometimes I'll play with harmonic things like that as well. But I've forgotten the name of the Sub plugin. But
I think it's Subharmonic or not Sub.
Sub
Filter, no Sub something. Yeah, it's the red one, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and it gives you 3 different frequency ranges, so you can really tune those harmonics. I love that one, and one of the reasons I got involved with Plugin Alliance is because they are so musical. I saw the amount of work that goes into crafting the sound and getting it as true as they can, sitting at a console to make sure the harmonics on the EQ, when you increase the 3K by 3 dBs on SSL 4000A and comparing it to the plugin to make sure that it actually sounded exactly the same, So that Sub plugin, the red one, the fact that it gives you 3 different frequency ranges for your sub, and you can really tune in the harmonic that you want. It's just beautiful. It's fantastic.
Do you commonly use low pass filters?
Low pass. Yeah. Sometimes on my master bus, on my main bus, on the main bus with the digital V3 EQ, I may slightly roll off. Oh wait, did you say high pass or low pass? Yeah.
Pass.
So
did I say no? I say low pass, but I'm low pass. No, I meant high pass filter. I'm sorry, I meant high pass.
You know what? After 47 years, it still bugs me.
Yeah.
High pass,
low pass.
High pass takes off the lows. Low pass takes off the highs.
Yeah.
I've had to re-educate myself that with the high pass, you allow the high frequencies to pass.
Yeah.
And with the low pass, occasionally, if I need to on the main fader, which I'm contradicting that you shouldn't do too much, but sometimes I will slightly often at a sharp curve, at 12, 18 dB curve, I'll just pull off at like 25 or 28 or maybe 30 hertz if I need to. If I feel that I've got too much of that, I would much rather go back to the track and think, okay, that's probably my bass, which is doing that. So let me do that on the bass track and deal with it there. Because otherwise, if I do it on my main fader, maybe I want some of that to breathe through a little bit. So again, I would rather go back to the initial instrument that needs to have that pass, that the low frequencies filtered off. So I'll try and go back, but occasionally on the digital V3 on the main fader, I will put not very high in frequencies, but again, maybe the 25 to 28 kind of range. I'll have a very sharp, 18 or 24 dB drop off.
So let's set the technical stuff aside for a moment. Can you share what it was like? Can you
I've been bluffing so much. That's fantastic.
Can you share what it was like working at Trident Studios?
Oh, man. It was intense. It was really intense. I got in 1978. I quit law school after 1 year. I'd gone to law school as a way of getting to London. I was born in a town called Brighton on the south coast, and needed to get to London. I'd put a band together at school. The band was crap. I thought, obviously, it's because I need to be in a big town, so I need to get to London. Moved to London. I thought if I go to university for a year, my dad was a musician, so I can qualify for government assistance. Basically, as long as I go to my classes, I can afford to move to London, put a band together in London, which is going to have all these musicians, and I can become a rock star. That was my plan. I took a gap year off between leaving school and moving to university in London, and I worked on construction sites in Brighton. And then I used to travel a lot. When I was 16, I was backpacking around Europe. Then I was working for an exchange language school every holiday, so I was always traveling. And so after I'd done a few months on construction, made a bit of money, I wanted to go back for the rest of the year and go back to friends I had in Sweden. So I went back and worked in Sweden. And the first time I went backpacking, I was broke after a week. I was literally looking for food in trash bins. I was going to markets at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when all the fruit was still on the ground, but it was still okay because it hadn't been there for long. And then I'd take the fruit and go to a public place or go to the beach if I was near a beach, and under the beach showers, I'd wash the fruit. And I was surviving like that. When I went back in this year off to live in Sweden, I thought the first thing you have to do when you travel is get a job with food. Essential. So I got a job in a restaurant in the mornings. I went for the job to be a washer-up. As I arrived, the sous chef quit and walked out, and the main chef said to me, "Can you cook?" And I lied and I said, "Yeah, of course." So he said, "Fine, we've got service in 2 hours. That's your station. You're the new sous chef." So I learned to cook. And then I worked in a bakery, and at night I worked in the first McDonald's in Stockholm in 1976. It was wild. Anyway, came back, went to university, failed law miserably. I passed contract law. I came third, which was very useful. I failed all the other subjects. And I thought, I put a band together at college. We were still crap. And I thought, wow, so it's not the town that I'm in, which is why my bands are crap. It's more to do with me. So maybe I should get into a studio and find out how it's done. I wrote 100 letters. I got one interview. I was 20 years old. I got one interview, and that was from Trident. Went for the interview, and the studio manager said, "Why did you write to us?" And I said, "Well, I'm wondering if you've got any jobs for a record producer. I'd like to be a record producer, please." And he laughed, and he said, "Do you know anything about the studio?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, a few people have done okay, but I see from your letter that you sent me that you've worked on construction and you can cook." I said, "Yeah." He said, "We're enlarging the control room to put a new window in and to put a bigger console, which was the A range. I want you to do construction to do all the shit jobs no one else wants to do. Start at 9 a.m. At 4 in the afternoon, come to me, tell me how much money, how much petty cash you need to cook for 15 people 3-course meals. On the 5th floor of the building, there's an electric stove with 4 rings and an oven. I want you to cook for 15 people 3-course meals. When you finished cooking, you can serve the food, clean up the kitchen, and then you can go back to construction, 9 a.m. to 3 a.m., 6 days a week for the next 3 months, and I'll pay you £20 a week, which was about $25. And I thought, wow, I'm in, and I get paid, So that's how I got in. But Trident was amazing. The first record I saw being made was Peter Gabriel's second album. It's known as Scratch. It's the one where he's like tearing the cover. Tony Levin on Chapman Stick on bass, David Rhodes on guitar, Manu Katché on drums, and also Joey Marotta on drums. Sensational. I knew nothing about Trident. Soon after I started doing the construction and everything, one night I thought everyone was gone or no one was around. I sat down at the piano, touched the piano I couldn't play, and someone came charging into the room screaming at me like, "What the F do you think you're doing?" And I was like, "I don't know." He says, "Have you got any idea what's been recorded on that piano?" My voice was like, "I don't know." And it's like my voice just, in the end, my voice, only a dog could hear it. It was so high. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, he said, "Do you know what's been recorded on that piano?" I said, "No." He said, "The Beatles' Hey Jude and the White Album, David Bowie's first 3 albums, Space Oddity, Hunky Dory, Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, Lou Reed Transformer, The Band Free, T-Rex, George Harrison's first 2 albums, Elton John's first 3 albums, John and Yoko, Harry Nilsson, Schmilson, Carly Simon, You're So Vain." And I didn't know that there was a band signed to Trident, and they were given demo time at like 2 in the morning until 6 in the morning to do their demos. And in return, they signed a 5-album deal with the studio, and that was Queen.
Oh.
So the first 5 Queen albums were owned by Trident and licensed to the label. Trident was amazing. Whereas Abbey Road, which is famous, amazing engineers, Jeff Emmerich, fortunately got to know him, just wonderful person, phenomenal engineer, groundbreaking. But Ken Scott had been at Abbey Road and moved to Trident during Hey Jude, the White Album, then for the Bowie albums. I did some projects at Abbey Road. Abbey Road was so strict. Jeff Emmerich told me that he nearly got fired 3 times on the Beatles records, of which he did 6 or 7 years, for moving the microphones, because at Abbey Road, the engineer wasn't allowed to touch the mics. He'd have to leave a plan, on the desk saying, tomorrow, 12 p.m. or 2 p.m., Ringo drums. And the techs who wore the white lab coats with their pens and pencils in it. And I remember seeing that. They would set up the microphones in the Abbey Road way, and Jeff wasn't meant to change it, while at the same time, you've got the Beatles saying, "We want it to sound like it's backwards and dreamy," to George Martin. And George goes, "Jeff, you got that? Okay, get on with it. Make it sound backwards and dreamy." At Trident, we were really encouraged to be individuals, to be unique. There was a really strict way in the level of professionalism, which was insane. But Trident was really tough. After being the chef and builder stuff, I got promoted to being a tea boy, which is like a runner. And you had to bring tea and coffee, to all the rooms. There were 5 floors. Something I didn't appreciate at the time is like, you couldn't bring a random tray with half tea and half coffee and milk and sugar. You had to memorize everyone in the room, everyone in the band, what they wanted, if they liked it hot, warm, strong, weak, lots of sugar, no sugar, milk, no milk, just a splash. You had to memorize all of that. And I thought this would be so much easier if we could just have some milk on the tray and, some water and sugar. But later I realized, if you can't remember how someone likes their cup of tea or coffee, how are you going to remember when you're on a record for 3 or 6 months and there's 60 reels of tape, and each track has to be notated of what each track has on it and where your punch-ins are, and you have to learn the detail to punch in and out for one note of a solo without erasing anything important. And I realized the real value of that. If you couldn't handle that, how are you going to handle being on a session? So they only ever needed 3 T-boys, 4 tape-op assistants, and 4 engineers, because we had 2 rooms. We had the recording room and the mixing room, 2 sessions generally each day, midday to midnight, midnight to midday. So you needed, 2 teams of 4 and basically 3 T-boys. So 3 T-boys were needed, there were always 4. 4 tape-ops were needed, there were always 5. And nearly every month someone would get fired. So you could not make a mistake. It was brutal. You could make a mistake. Or if you were asked something, if you're on the session and there's an engineer and the engineer says, oh, can you set up this and that? And you say, oh, I don't know how to do that. They'd say, get on the phone, call an assistant who knows how to do that. And then that was it. That was the end of your job. As you left the room, the other assistant would walk in, give you a nice little shoulder bump, and pretty much you were going to be bounced down or bounced out the building. Mm-hmm. It was so competitive. It was kind of scary. But like anything, if you want to be good, that level of competition, it could have been a bit more humane at times. Absolutely. People could have treated each other a lot better. But behavior in the studios in the 1970s and 80s was out of control. Working with the artists, often their behavior was out of control, and the engineers and the producers. And the thing was, if you couldn't handle it, then you weren't going to be there. It taught you a lot about people and personalities and how at times to be a chameleon, and also to look at the situation and try and navigate what is my path on this record? What is my role on that record? How am I going to navigate my way through? Because sometimes you were working with musicians or an artist that you didn't like that much. But it was an amazing experience because that's life. You don't always get to pick and choose, and you have to learn, especially if you were going to make it to producer, how to handle these personalities, how to motivate them, how to direct them, when to push them, when to back off, how to manipulate them invisibly or, right up in their face. So it was an incredible education. And pretty much every day we had the elite of the elite in there. Mm-hmm. So my first experience of having my hands like on the tape machine was when Kiss did their first 4 solo albums. And I worked on all 4 with Mike Stone engineering and producing. And Mike Stone had been the tape-op who got to do Queen's demos at 2 a.m. in the morning at Trident. He'd just been promoted from T-Boy and was going to be an engineer. And the studio manager said, after your day session finishes at midnight, I need you to do demos with this band. And then be back for the day record, but you can't tell the day record that you were up all night doing demos. So Mike was the guy that drew the short straw and had to come in and stay on at night and do demos with this unknown band who happened to be Queen. And then he did the first 5 albums and obviously became a major engineer producer. And I worked with Mike for over 2 years, from bringing him tea and coffee to in the end engineering with him. I would often do background vocals on records he was producing because I was doing sessions as a background singer at times. He knew I could sing so often at the last minute if he felt the song needed some more harmonies. Not Queen. Queen were okay, they could handle it themselves. But if it was on a certain rock record and he just felt it needed a bit more, I would do that. But very much I came up under Mike Stone as one of my mentors, and then an amazing engineer who now lives in the west of England, near where Peter Gabriel's studio is, Stephen W. Taylor. They were my 2 big mentors, and they often kept my job at Trident. They kept me in because they loved having me on sessions and would always ask for me. So that was really important.
Nice. Can you tell us about your work with The Cure, Rush and U2?
The Cure was wild. I was between records. I had 1 day off. Dave Allen, and these records were like 3 or 6 months that I'd been on. I was completely fried. I needed my 1 day. Dave Allen, who'd produced pretty much all of the Cure stuff from accidentally doing their demos when he and this unsigned band turned up at the same demo studio. They were double booked, and because they were both there, they asked Dave if he knew how to work the studio, and he bluffed and said, yeah. He did their demos. The band got signed. He became their producer. And there was never a better match made in musical heaven than Dave Allen and Robert Smith and The Cure. Just such out there, crazy, like minds, so imaginative. Anyway, on one of the singles, Dave, I'd been working with Dave on other stuff, and Dave asked if I would come in and record one of the songs. And I had a day off, and I thought, you know what? It's The Cure. It will look cool on my discography. I don't think it's going to be too much. We'll go in, record some stuff, and, I can still maybe have the night off. We were at Trident on the A range, and the band didn't turn up. And 2 hours, the band didn't turn up. 4 hours, the band didn't turn up. I said to Dave, do you really need me here? And he's like, yeah, mate, I really need you to, And I said, well, why? And he said, well, there's going to be some really weird sounding stuff. And the video for the song, he said, the bands are going to be in a wardrobe. And the wardrobe goes over a cliff, and they're all inside the wardrobe. And there's water coming in, and they got their feet in each other's faces. And it's got to be really claustrophobic. And I need you to really kind of like capture that kind of feeling. And then he said, yeah, and Robert's going to be doing all this like loud kind of squeaky stuff. And Dave put his like hands to my ear and did the most incredible impersonation of Robert Smith I've ever heard in my life. And he's like, all this kind of stuff, which is all through the record. Anyway, after 8 hours, the band arrived. After 8 hours. And I was thinking, oh my God, I could have had the day off. They were completely drunk. Because they're not now, but in those days they had, some issues with alcohol and stuff. And we did all the vocals and we did all the horns. The song was close to me. And when Dave said that the video, this became so instrumental to me in visualize the song and then create the sounds that are going to suit the vision. So when he said that Robert's going to be all the bands are going to be in a wardrobe, I thought, well, it's got to sound claustrophobic. It's got to sound a bit dull and a bit claustrophobic and really tight, like there's no air. If I'd have done the song, with a harsh mid-range kind of punchy voice and there was a slap-back delay on it, and then you see the video and they're inside a wardrobe, complete disconnect. It wouldn't have worked. So because I had the visual, I could craft the sound for that concept. So with the gobos in the studio, and we had, the big ones without windows that are just fabric, so I got 4 of them, and I made a box the size of a wardrobe. And we actually had wooden lids that had been made to fit on top so that we could isolate a guitar amp or something in gobos. So I put the lid on as well. And I think I put a 47 in there, maybe a 67 to get a warmer sound. I knew it was already going to be warm. David said that it must have been a Tube 47. David said that he was going to be doing a lot of breathy stuff as well. There's a lot of syncopated breathing on that single. So when Robert arrived, not only did I put him in this box that had no windows with a lid on it, not only did it sound claustrophobic, but he felt claustrophobic. And that was such a major part of my process of create the space, the environment, so that the performer can get into character. Whatever kind of song it is. Sometimes with a singer that can only perform if there's an audience, I need to call the manager and say, we're doing vocals at 6 o'clock. Can you accidentally turn up at the studio with a few friends? Because if there's a few friends in the room, then the singer's going to start to perform. Other times I might have to clear the room and have no one in there to get the singer into the right frame of mind. Mm-hmm. But with every song, I have to think about the concept and then think about what is my approach to direct the performance so it suits the concept. This track with The Cure, Close to Me, was like obviously one where everything came together. concept, sound, and performance. So Robert did all the breathing, all the squeaky noises. He did the lead vocals. He did all the hand claps. Everything was like a few goes, maybe 2 or 3 goes. Boom, done. Absolute genius. I bumped into him maybe 2 or 3 days later, and not wanting to be too much fanboy, but I said, mate, I've just got to say what you did, the other day on that song, was amazing. And he looked at me and he went, yeah. What song was it? He didn't remember recording close to me one of the biggest single, which I think is testimony to his genius. And after we'd done all the vocals and hand claps and breathing and all of his stuff, then the horn players came in. And shortly before this, I'd been doing some work with Earth, Wind and Fire, which was all really punchy, sharp sounding, really staccato kind of playing. The horn players came in and started warming up, and it sounded like their instruments were rusty. The instruments sounded so dull and flat. And I turned to Dave and I said, oh man, don't tell me that you want them to sound like Earth, Wind and Fire. And he went, no, mate, I want you to get the worst fucking horn sound you've ever got. And I said, with these guys, I can do it. Anyway, he explained that the purpose of the horns was to sound like a New Orleans, like funeral march kind of band. So it's going to be lazy and very laid back and kind of loose. And there's a brilliant thing in the song which shows Robert Smith's awareness of like pop, because the main phrase that the horn plays is ba-ba-da-ba-da-da, ba-ba-da-ba-da-da, bap-bap-bap. That's the main thing that they play. But before the horns come in, which is like halfway through, Robert Smith is singing that line really quietly. He's just singing it and introducing the hook before it happens. Such pop awareness. Obviously they're an amazing alternative band, but also with a lot of their songs, such amazing awareness of like pop and pop songs and structure. So anyway, we did the horns, all the horn parts, and then Dave wanted them to freestyle, just the solo. And the two players, the tenor sax and the trumpet, were playing, but they weren't playing off each other. I couldn't get them to work and to vibe off each other, or actually to play phrases that were complete. And in the end, I didn't know what to do. I said, look, I'm going to give you 3 goes each. I'm going to take all the vocals out, just play anything. I'm going to play the song from the top to the end, play anything. And once they did 3 takes each of like random stuff, as it went through, I was making notes, take 2, 2 minutes 11, first 3 notes, circle it, good. Take 1 minute 11, the 2 end notes could be the beginning of the phrase for the other thing. And after they'd gone, I then went and compiled all the trading off that they're doing, where they're riffing off each other. None of that was played. I chose 2 notes here, 3 notes there, created a trumpet phrase, and then I had to look at the tenor sax. I had been a horn player early on. I played alto sax, so I understood horns and horn arrangement, which is also why Dave wanted me there, because he knew I did that. So I constructed all of that soloing trading off that they do. But once I put together a trumpet phrase, I had to then think, how can I construct a tenor sax phrase that sounds like it answered what the trumpet played? All of that was done. Choose 2 notes here, 3 notes there, play it onto a 2-track machine, record it onto a 2-track, then go to a spare track, play the multi-track, punch into record, play the 2-track, try and get the 2 notes, punch out, stop it. And that's how I put all those horn phrases together. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how you get there. As we all know, all the work that we put into recording, producing, mixing a song is insane, how much work we put in. At the end of it, people won't like your song because they know how hard you worked. They'll like your song or not because it resonates with them, or it doesn't, or it makes them feel a certain way, or it makes them feel nothing. The work that you put in to get there is just part of the journey to get to the end result. But again, if you don't have a concept about the end result, how are you going to arrive there?
Exactly.
So Yeah, that was with The Cure. With Rush, I think you mentioned.
Yeah.
That was my first experience of having my hands on the faders. We didn't have automation. This was permanent waves. I'd moved from being a T-boy to being a tape op on Hemispheres, the album before. On permanent waves, I was higher up. I was tape op, senior tape op, getting near engineering. All the drums, all the basic tracks were either done at the studio in Toronto in Canada, or they'd record them at Rockfield in Wales, which is where Queen, that was the alternative studio for Queen, because Ted Sharp, who'd been one of the original Trident guys in '73, had moved to Wales, built the studio, and had put an A range in there as well. And Rush always wanted to record on Trident A ranges, which is what the studio had. So all the basic tracks were done somewhere else. Neil Peart would never come to the overdub session, which would take weeks of, bass solos, guitar solos, chorus, pedals, vocals, all the backing vocals, all the extra layers, all the synths and all of that stuff. So we spent weeks adding all that stuff with Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. And Neil Peart would be probably in the cabin somewhere in Canada writing the lyrics and then mailing the lyrics, over to them in a letter. The console had 40 faders in 4 blocks of 10. And the way we used to mix was all hands on deck. It's the first time I got to sit with the grown-ups at the A range. I had my own 10 faders. The chairs were too big for the size of the console, so we were all squashed up, 10 faders each, myself, Terry Brown, Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson. And I hadn't understood what mixing was. I'd been in the room running the tape and doing punch-ins and all of that stuff and running the 2-track when the other guys before then had been mixing and making sure that I got the mix on the 2-track. But I didn't understand what the process of mixing was. I thought, well, they've spent all this time recording. All the notes that they've played are great. They all sound great. So I presume that you just put the faders up and that's kind of it. Which is what mixing used to be when you had 3 and 4 track and mixing consoles were just on a lever. All the instruments were already bounced down together with their effects. Mixing engineers were called balancing engineers because that's all you could do. Balance the faders, put a little bit of sweetener, reverb on 1 or 2, and that would be your mix. That would be about as much as you could do, EQ a little bit. I didn't realize that mixing, especially as the technology got bigger, there were more tracks you could record on, have more instruments, the consoles got bigger, and suddenly mixing became much more expansive in what you could actually do. And mixing Rush is my first experience, although being the junior on the table with, the grown-ups, I realized that mixing was about performance. You've spent ages capturing the notes and the sound of the notes. Now you perform them even more to another level in terms of playing with volumes, playing with spatials, reverb or delays on a send, increase it, reduce it, pan something a bit to the side, then pan it back in, hear what the other guys are doing. If they're moving something into the middle or you've got an instrument, maybe move it a little bit out of the way while they're doing that and then respond back. And we would play sections of this, especially Rush. I mean, there's nothing like being thrown in at the deep end. But this was, I think the first one we mixed was maybe Spirit of Radio, because they needed the single to be out. And we had to mix it in sections of like the intro and then the verse up to the chorus. And we would spend hours just playing combinations on the faders, 10 faders each, to get the right magic to happen in the right moment. Always recording what we were doing on the console. The new tape op, because I was now at the desk, had to be recording on the 2-track and also running the 4 other stereo machines that had delays on, tape delays. And we would set the tape delays with pulling the tape off the tape machine after the record head before it hit the playback, pull it off, put the tape around a mic stand, and then feed it back to the record head. To the playback. So if you were sending the lead guitar to stereo machine 4 would record the guitar that you were sending from button 3 on the console it would record it. And then before the recording of it on the tape hit the playback head, playback was recorded, you'd pull it off, put a length of tape around the mic stand, and then the sound that was recorded would come back to the playback and you'd hear it delayed. So the length of the delay would depend on how much you pulled out the mic stand. So the tape op had to be running the 2-track recording, the result of the mixing console, and running 4 other tape machines that all were at different speeds, different lengths of delay. And when I was a tape op, it was like you were spinning plates on sticks, and you were constantly running between, making sure that they were all going, that there was enough tape, none were going to run out. But I really learned in that experience that mixing was about performing the performance that you've already recorded, and now you bring it to life. And by using spatials or panning or creating little events, just changes in volume, create a new event for the listener. And I realized how organically you could take a song that initially I thought was complete and done. You could take it to a whole new level through mixing and bring a whole new world of feeling and life into it. So for me, it was absolutely groundbreaking to have that experience. You know, obviously sitting with Terry Brown and Geddy and Alex was pretty cool as well, and terrifying. You know, I think I was 21 by then.
Do you miss working on tape?
No.
After doing all of that?
No. These days I can get everything. I don't miss it because I know so clearly how it sounds that I can completely recreate that in the box. You know, I know that I can, if I want that real old warm analog 15 IPS, you know, half-speed sound of using tape, I can use Neve 80 series plugins on every channel, and that's going to start to make it sound a bit like tape. And depending on the gain on the red button, you know, on the red dial, I can get a bit of saturation on the input, which is how we would use volume on tape to get it to saturate a little bit. So, you know, the fact that you could only record like 15 minutes of music, you know, 15 minutes and 32 seconds, I think, is what you could get on a reel of tape at 30 IPS. The fact that after you'd recorded 3 times, you didn't really want to keep recording, so you had to go to a new reel of tape. I don't miss how cumbersome it was, how complicated. I remember for a movie recording solo piano with Rod Argent, who was in the band Argent. He wrote, you know, the song She's Not There, which Carlos Santana had a big hit with. He had a big hit with his band Argent called Hold Your Head Up in the 60s, early 70s. Rod Argent, phenomenal piano player. The lead singer was Colin Blunstone in those bands. And I was in the control room recording the famous Trident piano with this legendary pianist there, and Phil Ramone was producing. And there's just me and Phil. I hadn't met him before. We were in the control room. Again, I was 20-nothing. I was maybe 21. And I was having to punch in to record on piano takes. And then we did hours of piano takes. And then with Phil Ramone standing there, I had to edit the 2-track from different takes, trying to listen for the harmonics and the sustain of the harmonics on the piano in my mind when I went to reel 5, second take, you know, 3 minutes in, and made a cut on that tape, and then had to take the section out, go back to my first one, join them together, see if it worked or if it didn't work. I mean, that's pressure. Phil Ramone was an absolute loveliest guy ever, absolute gentleman. He was so calm. I really nailed it. I edited that together so quickly. I was so hyper-focused. But it was fun. It was exciting. But it was also a bit of a pain in the butt. And I don't miss how cumbersome that was. You know, and these days the budgets, you just don't have the budgets. And you can't even get good tape. Yeah. You know, you can't rely on a good batch of tape. So, and I've done some tape stuff like 10 years ago, the Nika Costa album with Lenny Kravitz. He wanted to do everything on tape, which we did. We went on tape at 15 IPS. And the minute we had the backing tracks down, I was already recording through the vintage Neve. I had 23 outboard compressors, which were all vintage. So even into Pro Tools, I had a vintage sound, and I tried to persuade him not to use tape, but he wanted to do it. So we recorded on tape. Once we had all the backing tracks down, I had to bounce everything back into Pro Tools and punch up all the sounds a little bit, because we lost a lot of the sound that was coming in. If you've got beautiful mics and you've got a vintage console, and you know how to craft the sound, if you've learned about sound and how to capture it and give it character, these days I don't need to introduce tape to add another character to it and to wash out the frequencies even more. The sound I'm hearing through the mic, through the console, through maybe my outboard compressors, if I'm recording, that's the sound I want to hear back. And so if I'm going straight into Pro Tools, that's what I'm going to get. And again, if you understand organic analog sound, you can absolutely recreate it in the box using analog modeled channel strips and so on. Mm-hmm. So my quick answer was, do I miss tape? No.
Adam, you have a mixing course, right? Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, that's really fun. After at Trident, I brought a lot of people through. You mentioned U2 before. I don't need to go into that one, but I went back to Trident in the 80s because the studio changed hands. They bought a second studio. They put an SSL in, and that's how I became one of the first SSL guys in the UK. And some of my suggestions are still in the software for SSL. Really? So this was around 1983. And I put a new team of people together with the owners of the studio. And that included Flood, Alan Mulder, Spike Stent. Alan assisted me for 15 months and then went on to be the most phenomenal engineer, producer. Flood from Achtung Baby has been on every U2 album. Alan got involved on it. Spike Stent has ended up mixing most of that, if he's not mixing Coldplay the same day, or Beyonce, or Harry Styles, or everyone else in the world. So we put together, and Al Clay, who was also one of my team, went off and started to work when Hans Zimmer had been our go-to keyboard guy, and he started to do quite well in the 80s, so he put his own studio together, and Al Clay left Trident to go and be Hans's engineer, and then obviously off to Hollywood and a house full of Oscars. So it was an amazing team that we put together then. When I finally got to work on a U2 remix with Dave Siddick from TV on the Radio, I was so relieved because everyone else I knew from that team had loads of U2 credits, and I just wanted my one. It was okay. So I brought a lot of people through then. Through my career, I feel that I mentored and brought a lot of people through. When I had the Boat Studio, again, I had a team of like 4 people working there who I was really training and bringing the old school values of listening and just even the people skills, bringing that through. So we had tape, obviously, but also working in the box with Pro Tools and so on. When the Boat was sold, Flea from the Chili Peppers bought it, I kind of thought, well, now what? I want to still share this information because people of my era were either leaving the profession or leaving this world, and I thought there's so much information which, unfortunately, with studios disappearing, the opportunities are disappearing for young music makers and would-be producers to get into studio and engineers to get into a studio and learn the trade bottom up. So it was really important for me to teach and share the information I knew, not in terms of doing an audio class or sit down, and this is Pro Tools. If you go to the, edit window, go down to the 5th option, click on that. I got no interest in that. My only interest in teaching is to share the emotional response to sound. How do you create the sound that makes the listener feel a certain way? And hopefully, how do you create the emotion in a song, in a mix, in a performance, so that the listener hears what you were experiencing? That's the whole quest of music. How do you create the sound of emotion? And although there's loads of tutorials, and you can look and see what a compressor does, and attack and release and threshold. It's not teaching you how to use that musically in an emotional response kind of way. So that was the world that I really wanted to share. I got involved with UCLA. Then I was asked to be early on when UCLA, Hope Albert School of Music, was starting to put together the music industry program that was going to include music production. I think I was the first music production person in there. So I started doing that around 2017 at UCLA Hope Albert, teaching the art of music production. And again, it's not technical. If anything's technical for me, I just glaze over, the curtain comes down. I don't need to know how different microphones work, but I can do a blindfold test, and you can sing into 12 different microphones. I can probably tell you what they are, which microphones they are, by the sound, if I've listened to your voice beforehand. So that's very much what I wanted to share. So I teach 2 courses on what is the art of music production. I was then invited. I've done various guest things at different school, music schools, but I was invited to Berkeley, the postgrad school in Valencia in Spain, and did a masterclass again on the art of music production. Basically, from demand from my students, and also after doing the YouTube 1-hour tutorials for Plugin Alliance on mixing, a mix from start to finish, and my conceptual approach to it, that led to a lot of requests. Am I doing mixing classes? And I didn't want to do one of these general big company things. I wanted it to remain my own and to be my style. And again, not to be told what the format is. So that's when I started doing my own mixing classes, which I do pretty much every month. They're just 3 weeks, 2 classes a week, 2 hours each week. So it's a 12-hour course. If you look up my website, adammoseley.net, and then you can find the information on there, and you can sign up and register. But again, even in the mixing courses, I show the basics and how I go about it and how I use EQ and compression, and I break all of that down. But then everyone on the course, and I keep the groups really small, they can share one of their own songs, and I'll deep dive into one of their songs, so they've got their hands on the tricks that we're doing and setting up auxiliary or return tracks and bus sends and EQing and playing with compression or sidechain compression. So I involve all the people on each course and on each group. And I do different groups. I do a West Coast group, an East Coast group, a European group, and I'd love to do a South American group. Yeah, absolutely. But I love it. I love sharing the experience that I've had in a way that it's been applied to making music, hopefully to make music that feels the way it's meant to feel.
Adam, thank you so much for walking us through such a complex topic. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. It's great to chat with you again.